Hello and welcome to another episode of the Under the Pines podcast. I am your host, Max Emmanuel. Today's episode is about math, about algos, about the blockchain, about economics, right? So if that is something that interests you, listen in. So today's guest is Noah Healy. He is a professional algorithm developer and mathematician. We talked about the dangers of AI, the potential issues with the blockchain, about mass media, cargo cults. We also talked about several historic events, that play a role in today's world. And we talked about his work, his patent pending, which has been the case for many years now. It really seems like there is, something going on in the background because it seems that he is running in a circle with the progress there. The congressional office and the patent office and all these government bodies are, yeah, not really helping, to say the least. So, if you want to know about these topics, if you want to dive deep on, how the world works in the background, why the commodity markets are so influential and are so important to understand, then jump in to this episode. Please like and subscribe. And if you have a friend or family member that you would like to share this with, please do so. It doesn't cost you anything and it helps us a lot. So I appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in once again, and I will see you on the next one. Hello, Noah. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Max. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. So you are a professional algorithm developer, recreational mathematician, right? And you've become an expert on game theory. You also, work on like your podcast that you started last year. Also work on Core Disk, which we'll talk about later. But one of these goals that I have with this podcast is to understand humanity a bit better, and therefore, I would love to understand you a bit better. So, how was when did you understand that like numbers and algorithms and systems fascinated you, right, and that you were wired this way?
Uh, Fairly early on in introduction to mathematics, I demonstrated a high facility. I was, the fastest counter and the fastest adder and the fastest multiplier. I kind of checked out of math class for a lot of elementary school because they essentially just teach you arithmetic over and over and over and over again, to make sure that kids are drilling into their heads. And since I got it the first time, I didn't really pay very much attention to what they were saying after that. Uh, I was fortunate enough we had reasonably developed sort of school enrichment programs, and so I was introduced to set theory and a number of other advanced mathematical concepts in early childhood. And I played around with some of these ideas, um, like multiplying multi-digit numbers and negative numbers, and when those systems were more advanced than they were taught, and so the teachers basically said things to me like, "Oh, negative numbers don't exist," and that sort of helped with the checking out process. Uh, but my sixth grade teacher was actually the head of the math department for my middle school, and she had been working for quite some time to advance mathematical education. And my grade, two other children and myself, both scored quite well on this algebra aptitude test, which she'd been giving for years. We were apparently the first three students to uh, score high enough on this aptitude test. Um, it wasn't really for sixth graders, so the cutoff was 95%. Uh, but it's not something that 1 in 20 sixth graders should actually do. It was, I think, more for eighth or ninth graders. So, the brain develops fast at that age. So
Yeah.
it was pretty rare. Anyhow, 3 of us made it. And so we were put into a class with eighth graders, and grade mixing at that age is basically unheard of. Um, but uh, myself and one of the other students did quite well. And we were joined by a student who had transferred in. His parents had moved from the Midwest, where they were in a very accelerated mathematical program. He had been attending school year round for mathematics from a young age. So rather than our traditional kind of 2 semesters, then take the summer off, 2 semesters, then take the summer off, he did 2 semesters, then a semester over the summer, then, you know, the other half of the following year, and the first half of the year after that, and then the final half of that, and so on. So he was up a few grade levels, and so we took geometry together. I then went to high school, where my teacher was, again, as it happened, the head of the math department. And it was another one of these confluence of events. There were a handful of boys whose fathers were all professors at the university. I live in a university town. Um, 2 of them in the math department, one in a different one, but they wanted their sons to accelerate their mathematical educations, and convinced the school to do a summer pre-calculus class that they were going to homeschool their kids in, and just come in and take the test and like skip them up a grade. But that one and only year they did it is the one and only year I was sort of qualified and useful for it. So I slipped through that. Um, and so then I'm suddenly 2 grades up, and I'm taking calculus. And after that, they started sending me to that university I just talked about. Uh, and yeah, so it's more a case of, it's always been pretty easy for me to reason logically. Certainly much easier than other people's behavior makes it appear that it is for them.
Okay. So did you have problems because you were different? Was that an issue?
Well, I mean, I didn't have problems because I'm a loner, so it didn't really
Yeah.
that didn't really come up. But yeah, I've had communication issues basically forever. I was also diagnosed learning disabled at around the same time that my mathematical facility was identified. Uh, so I'm of an age where, in addition to standardized testing, actually intelligence testing was a fairly standard part of public school education. That has been largely decried and pulled back from, uh, basically because the children of politically connected and wealthy people don't score as highly as their very powerful parents would like them to. Traditionally, there's this thing called regression to the mean that more or less guarantees that will always be true. Anyhow, I was identified as having some specific form of dyslexia that is known colloquially as an IQ gap.
Mhm.
Basically, the way I think it's the Stanford Binet test works, is that they've identified sort of these high level intellectual capacities, things like memory, reasoning, um, uh, spatial manipulation, things like that. And they get your IQ by taking your scores in these regions and then averaging them together. But they get your
Mm.
scores on those subtests by creating batteries of tests. So for spatial reasoning, there are pictures where you're given a picture of some blocks linked together in some tetrisy 3-dimensional shape, and then a set of other pictures of the blocks from different perspectives, and you're asked which one of these pairs of things is in fact the same set or a different set of blocks, or there are tactile puzzles where you actually have to put tiles together to form particular images and shapes, and it's timed. Um, for memory, there might be a spelling section or a history section or both, or just asking you to memorize a list of words or numbers and then bring them back, and so on. And so there's this set of subtests, if you will. And the way that they get your subtest score is your subtests have to correlate with each other. So you have to be about as good a speller as you are a history student, as you are a random word regenerator, as you are a listen to a story and tell me things about it. Like, you have to be able to be about as good as all those things in order to have a memory score.
Mm.
And my subtests all discorrelated with each other. Um, I've got these things where I'm really good at the things I'm really good at, and I'm really bad at the things that I'm not really good at, and it kind of averages out to being pretty smart, but a lot of weird, unexpected flaws. My kind of infacility with names is one of the more common uh, uh, expressions of this particular issue.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's one of the problems, right, with school, that they try to squeeze you through that one, certain like hole. Everybody has to fit in that, right? And I mean that's on purpose, right? Because it discourages you and it makes you distracted, and in the end you don't really trust your instincts and your skills, right? Because you think you don't have any, because you all of a sudden, right, like you're bad at a lot of stuff, and then that's what they focus on, right? So when you look at the world and like you see problems and stuff like that, how does that, how's that thought process with you? Is that like really, does it move over to those things where you're really good at? Is that solely in that bracket then?
Uh, well, yeah. I've got sort of this large collection of tools, and if I can pattern match something that's being presented to me to one of those tools, I reach in, pull it out, and just slap it on top. I had an incident, it's a very memorable thing for me. When my first job, I was asked a question about buffer sizes, and as it happens, it was effectively identical to a question that was asked on one of my statistics classroom problems. Uh, it, there's this thing called the Poisson distribution. It was discovered by somebody doing research for Napoleon's army. It turns out that for an incredibly wide variety of things, they're all Poisson distributed. So if you're given preconditions that meet these conditions, and it's, at some point in your life you will be, because it's just that common. You just know what the answer is. You know that it's a Poisson distribution, and you can just immediately do the calculation to figure out what the probabilities are going to turn out to be, if you have access to one single parameter. And as it happens, they knew what the parameter was. So um, they were asking me, like, what kind of research project and how much information would it take to sort of gather the system together to create a confidence thing. And because of the structure of the question, I was just able to just cut to the chase. Like, well, no, that work's already been done. We know what the answer is. This is what the answer looks like. What's the cutoff sort of certainty you're looking for? We can just do this summation by hand until we get above that number, and then that's the buffer size you're looking for.
Mhm.
And so those are obviously very satisfying incidents. Um, but even in other cases, I've used design of experiments to innovate recipes before, and tried out variation of parameters in there's certain well-known patterns of parameter variation that allow you to much more rapidly explore the space of a large set of things that you can vary with a smaller set of experiments. And so just in home cooking, I've innovated several of my recipes in that fashion.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so that's basically how then you probably also got to your company or the project that you have that patent pending on that I'd like to talk about, maybe a bit later. But you called you came up with that term, the fourth age. Would you explain that a bit? Like, what's your thought behind
Right,
that?
sure. Well, this gets into some of my thoughts on history. There's a reasonably popular idea going around the world of cleodynamics, this notion that generations have characters and that there's some sort of sequence. The most popular sequence is sort of a 4-stage, but there are other claims that there are, 2-stage or 3-stage or 5-stage and other kinds of characteristic sequences of generations. I don't really subscribe that strongly to them. They look more rhetorical than grounded to me. But when I'm looking at history, I see very explicit events and tied to specific inventions that change human beings' energetic uh, relationship with their environment, and I mean energy in the physical sense of energy. So the inventions that I put in this category are the plow, the Watt steam engine, and now computers. And what they do, from my perspective, is that the plow uh, changes the food availability of the environment in a way that allows for high density human occupation. Um, you cannot build New York City as hunter gatherers, and the problem isn't that hunter gatherers don't necessarily have the socialization or the religion or some other BS political or cultural factor that would allow them to live in New York City. The problem is they would starve to death because just that many human beings on that much land, the land doesn't produce enough free calories for the human beings to be alive. So you can't do it. Um, the second one, the Watt steam engine, uh, is not only the first high efficiency steam engine that was invented. The Romans did have steam engines. They did work. Their efficiencies were poor, uh, but they might have been able to improve. Watt was improving other steam engine designs that had come before him. But what the Watt steam engine really did was it made physical human labor not the most economic form of physical work that existed on Earth. Prior to that, if you had a choice between having a man do work and a horse doing work, the man would do it for less caloric cost than the horse would. And the same is true for any other, domesticated animal. Uh, but with the Watt steam engine, it became practical to effectively put large scale, low cost physical work literally anywhere. And we now live today in a world where something like 90% of all the work, again, in the physical sense, that gets done on behalf of the human species is done by machines. And then the computer uh, changes control structures. So control is, again, I'm using the engineering term, which is when a low energy system determines the outcome of a high energy system. And again, for effectively all of human history, actually for absolutely all of human history, up until they started shipping these things, the lowest cost form of control system that existed on Earth was the human brain. And so if you had any decisions to be made, certainly any sophisticated decisions to be made. The only really practical way to do that was to have some human being whose job it was to make those decisions. And computerization means that we can now have, once again, machines making decisions, and this is already ubiquitous. If you look at old movies, you see police officers standing in intersections directing traffic. If you drive around on modern roads, you see machines carrying out that task. So um, that's what I see as the fourth age. And the reason I sort of think of them as ages is that I can see very clear cultural, religious, and political distinctions between the ways that human beings were organized in each of those phases of existence. And because of that, I expect our modern industrial states, our concept of modernity, our our sort of secularized religions, our culture of the way that people live, particularly in the West, which is sort of the peak state of the industrialized world. I'd expect that it's had its day, just as the divine right, monarchy, agrarian systems had their day when mechanized warfare came to call, and just as the pagan tribalist nomad types. Not to say that each of these systems does not still exist in some corners of our planet, but what takes over and becomes the dominant form of producing wealthy, politically powerful, scientifically interesting, historically vibrant human beings, I expect to change.
So would you say that you see the problem with AI there, and if you do, then what would you say are some of like the first ones that you would think about there? Because it certainly is going to be a part of our decline, right? If we don't know how to control and handle it, right? Because I mean, there's people that already say we're past that point, right? It's we cannot save that anymore, and there's others obviously that have a bit more hope. So I don't. What is your take on that?
Well, so I don't see any future for the current systems at all. Um, the the markets and governments that we um, have sort of been shown to be corrupt and broken, and it's not like stuffing the AI genie back under the bed is going to unknowledge those facts. So to me, what the AI problem is about is how do we sit down and do the work of figuring out a stabilized social structure that allows us to actually incorporate and utilize these technologies. This is like a constitutional convention style issue, where we're in the brave new world, whether we wanted to be here or not, and now we're going to have to build new things to cope with that, and um, and so that that's one end of it. The other end of it is the AI systems themselves, which have a wide variety of some fairly well publicized problems. I'm not terrifically terrified by Terminator or those kinds of stories. I'm also not particularly buoyed by Star Trek or those types of stories. Um, I think sort of a subtlety of Asimov. Are you familiar with his robot novels? Asimov posits in his robot novels the production of these machine slaves that are more moral than human beings. And his conclusion essentially is that being served by beings that are more moral than you so degrades the fiber of humanity that the society disintegrates, and sort of culture and nation and family all go away. Uh, and so I think if if AI were working the way that, if generative AI specifically were working the way that the companies promoting it claimed it was, which strikes me as impossible, then that would be the kind of risk that they would be exposing us to. But happily, since it's pretty obviously impossible that anything that they're saying about what they're doing could possibly be true. I think that the problem is more the case that these things are massive noise and potentially fraud machines, and there's a bandwidth carrying capacity that we are filling up with noise and potentially fraud, and people, well, so here's an example. There's this thing called body dysmorphia. Um, People who undergo large physical changes. So it's one of the things that can help feed into surgical addiction of people that get heavy into plastic surgery. Bodybuilders can suffer rather desperately from it, where you get big, but you can't see yourself as being big, so you think you're small. It's one of the things that helps produce the conditions for anorexia. It's not good. Basically, it's a derangement between what you think you look like and what you look like. And the thing is, as far as we can tell, it can literally happen to anybody. If you're exposed to images of yourself that your brain believes are of yourself, but don't look like the way your brain thinks, or changes fast enough from the way your brain thinks that you look, then you will get this syndrome and sort of go off into this sort of infinite loop problem. Um, it's incredibly on the rise. And one of the causes of its incredibly being on the rise is that smartphones have cameras on them, and those cameras have auto filters on them, and those auto filters change the way people look. And it means that human beings, instead of looking at mirrors, which show them what they actually look like, they're looking at cameras that show them a fantasy that doesn't look like them. And if you do it often enough, you will have body dysmorphia. And then if that goes unstable in a bad direction, it can have severe physical, consequences. And even if it doesn't, it can have pretty severe emotional consequences. Um, and that's the kind of, danger that I see. We don't have a, news dysphoria term, because we haven't had the capacity to think about those things, but we're seeing bubbling and other things occurring within internet diets, uh, and and generative AI cranks all that stuff up to 11, um, and that's enough all by itself to sort of shred society.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think I talked about this with some other guests as well. I think it starts with the kids, right? Like that's how you dismantle the whole thing, right? And that's how you make sure that the next generations are, running into serious problems. But yeah, I mean, even before, we started working on AI as humanity, we had it in a different way, right? Like you were looking at these so-called supermodels, like men on high heels, with these small waists, and the girls, when they're young now, they think they have to look like this, and it's pretty much impossible for them because they just don't have a dick. So it's
Yeah. Well, mass communication has been a serious issue. Uh, we have we have sort of very infamously, TikTok influencers or whatever who are pretending to be global travelers living fabulous lives that are,
Yeah.
shut-ins inside movie studios to create this content or whatever. But even things like um, makeup in, say, this time last century was very widely regarded as something that only prostitutes would deign to use. But film happened, and people were introduced to glamorous human beings who absolutely look better than most of us, and they wore makeup and smoked cigarettes, and so we started wearing makeup and smoking cigarettes. There's a thing I've brought out to several people. Have you ever heard of cargo cults?
No.
So there's kind of three phases of learning about cargo cults. So I'm going to introduce you to phase one. We'll see if we can get you to phase three. Cargo cults are a real thing. They happened in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Basically, the United States of America was, it's a first world nation. They've got planes, they've got metal ships. They're doing the island hopping strategy, and they're sending in boats to go clear jungle, lay down temporary airstrips, and then airplanes come in and unload cargo from the Ford factory, basically. And they were doing this essentially a stone's throw away from stone throwing, Neolithic tribes that were living nomadic lifestyles on some island out in the middle of the Pacific. Uh, and as a result of seeing this happen, many of those tribes, and some of these cults exist to this day, with tribes that, understand that it's not real, but it's still tradition. They built these sort of ramshackle, like mud thatch copies of the American installations. And you can find pictures of sort of witch doctors that are wearing palm frond duplicates of like a US radio man setup and sort of talking into a gourd. And they're doing this to pray to the gods for cargo, because these people just showed up and like wealth started coming out of the sky. And that's big medicine. Obviously there's something they're doing right for the gods to be handing them all this crap. We need to copy what we can see them doing so that gods start giving us this crap, because metal knives are way better than these stone tools. So that's stage one is, you find out it exists. Stage two is these silly primitives. Stage three is recognizing that's how humans work. It's all cargo cults. The marketplace, there's nobody alive today that works for the British government or the New York Stock Exchange or any other sort of large, important, stable institution, the Catholic Church, that invented that. They have no idea how this stuff got made. They didn't actually do it. They don't know anybody that did it. They don't know anybody that knows anybody that did it. These things have been around for centuries to millennia, uh, and it's just apprentices copying masters, copying apprentices who copied masters for centuries, and that's fine if you happen to have done something right in the first place, and everyone in the entire chain is copying that right thing. But it doesn't always work out that way, and and particularly with these large scale changes. Um, if you're going to move from an agricultural society where all work has to be done by people to an industrial society where most work can be done by machines, having serfs or slaves where people are tied to jobs or land severely limits your ability to bring machine labor to where it's most valuable. Rote, repetitive, hard, backbreaking work. And you're just not going to do it. And the Romans didn't do it. They used it to move set dressings around in plays, and then the empire disintegrated. So that that's the challenge, is that you need to recognize that as people, this is how we create and build and maintain our cultures. And and we cannot step outside that, but we can hopefully open our eyes every once in a while for some of it, and make some corrections and make a contribution that, when it gets copied, isn't going to be a total disaster.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely a problem, right? Like, I mean, I just remember from back in the day, right? Like when you kind of you're in school and then you see all these movies, Wall Street and all that kind of stuff. So finance is cool, like working in that sector, it's cool, right? Like you think that's the way to go, and then you grow up and like you're basically studying that stuff, and then you start reading some books, right? And then you're like, holy shit, this actually does look completely different from what I thought it is, right? And that's the thing, not a lot of people actually think about that whole thing, right? Like you just want to be that, right? You want to feel that, what you kind of felt when you saw someone that's probably part of that 0.01%, right? That kind of made it into that position. But to get there is a completely different story. So basically, you looked at the commodity market and you saw that there's room for improvement,
Um,
right?
that's
Is that
actually
how it
kind
worked
of
out?
backwards, from what actually
Backwards?
happened.
Okay.
So what I was doing was looking at communication systems, particularly communication systems that include machines, and realizing that we had very bad systems for doing that. I'd worked for a number of companies that uh, made mistakes, in some cases causing the companies to fail, in some cases just causing the company to lose enormous amounts of potential equity. But the reason we sort of know that they were mistakes is because at the time the decisions were made, it turned out, usually subsequently the discovery was made, that files existed, records existed at the company that demonstrated that this was a mistake. Um, and so it's not so much a, with hindsight we should have done it better. It's, with hindsight, we should have had access to the information that would have told us that we wouldn't have needed hindsight to have done it better. Um,
Kind of like
and
the typical silo thinking, right? In big companies where information is not exchanged at all times, right? Just
right,
certain.
right. But many of these companies were not that big. The issue is that the silo, if something is sitting in a log file somewhere and nobody looks at it, then
Mhm.
that's just as siloed as if you're in some kind of multinational with 500,000 employees, and there's, some team in outer Tibet that doesn't talk to anybody else and happens to know what the answer to the most important thing in the company is. Um, it's almost worse because, at least theoretically, our systems of talking to people and having relationships, you could fix that company culture. But if your problem is that you need machines to communicate with you, no amount of company culture is going to fix that. You have to fix that sort of algorithmic system at that point. So I was working on ideas about how you might be able to do that, because it would have been an utter disaster for these companies, and really for any company, to just do whatever your machines tell you to do. The human element and judgment needs to be a part of whatever's going on. But how do you get the information in the first place? So that that approach, basically the system of pricing transaction costs, I then applied to commodity markets, because I had taken econ, 101, 201, 202, whatever. And I'd been taught that the markets are perfect, that they are as efficient a tool for consensus gathering as possible. The only problem is that they're expensive, so you can't just set them up for everything. And so I was like, well, if I can solve this hard problem, which is an interesting thing for me to think about in the first place, and build a marketplace out of my system, then if that marketplace can be, in the ballpark of this system that's known to be perfect because there's this proof that it's perfect, then that would be a big validation. Like this, if you have something that's perfect and you have something that's 90% as good at it as it is, that you can use for other things, then that's pretty good. Uh, it was after discovering through the sort of validation process where I was writing up the code and then load testing it, that it was actually radically more efficient than the existing markets were. That I started re-examining the core proofs and the ideas behind the current market perfection, and that's where I started applying this noise signal dichotomy, which is something that communications industry has been using since its since their invention by the communications industry, so about 70 years ago now. And when you do that, the grounding assumptions that let you believe that the markets are perfect fall apart fairly quickly. And that's disastrous because obviously our lives are based on the economic organization that these markets are giving to us, and they're broken.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, if you just read a little bit into these topics, then there's a lot of price fixing going on, and full control. So basically, that's what you found out, and then you just dove deep into that, and you also signed a patent, or requested filing of a patent, and now you're having an issue with that, right?
Yeah, yeah. So the patent office is fairly slow, particularly if you can't afford to make them go faster. So it took uh, just a little over 3 years to get my first acceptance. That acceptance was then ignored. So it's like September 2019, we get a notice of acceptance. I cheer. Uh, I I get a call from or a letter, actually, an email from my attorneys a little while later saying that my examiner's supervisor. So again, just to get into the details, when you file for a patent, you're assigned to a patent examiner. They've got a stack of things on their desk. It takes them a while to get to it. Their job is to buckle down, learn what it is that you're trying to patent, and put it in the context of the industry that you're operating in, and then make decisions based on whether or not this is an idea that's already been had, if this is an idea that's actually useful, if this is an idea that's just actually obvious. And so if it's not obvious, it's actually useful, and this hasn't already been had, then that's it. You're supposed to get the patent. Um, their supervisors can come into play, but that's a fairly rare event. In this case, the supervisor calls up my attorney and tells him that they're probably going to ignore their acceptance. This isn't any kind of procedure at all. You know, the you get a speeding ticket, and then the desk sergeant calls up and says, you probably don't need to worry about it. Like, what? Why, huh? Um, so, so this is weird. My attorneys don't know what's going on. They have a speculation about this bizarre case that might be roiling things that the Supreme Court has agreed to look at. Um, and so we kind of hold back That's mostly what their advice has been. And I've talked to other patent attorneys, and that was sort of mostly like, get a clear picture of what's going on and then make your best pitch based on that. If things are unclear, sort of wait for them to clarify them and then react. So we're waiting around, but we can't wait forever, because come December, if we don't file for this thing after getting acceptance soon enough, then it just goes in the public domain. So just before that's going to happen, we do it. We file for this patent and say, hey, I actually want this thing that you say that I can have, and you haven't said that I can't have it. Like, there's a procedure for doing it. You haven't done it. So we do that. Then we don't hear back from them. So we send another thing where, hey, what's going on with this? And then they come back and they're like, yeah, we're not doing it. We'll get back to you soon. We haven't figured out why we're not doing it yet. So months go by. Yes. Months go by. Yeah. Spring of 2020, they get back to us with why they're not doing it. There's a few technical issues. My lawyer says these are no big deal. They've got it covered. They got to move some commas around. It doesn't change anything. They just there's some kinds of lawyer language that they were using, and there's different kinds of lawyer language that they were supposed to use now, and so they were going to change it. That was all fine. Nothing to do with me. Biggie is that they have this objection saying that this isn't patentable material because it's not an improvement. And that algorithms are judged in terms of their long-term growth rate, typically. So a task like addition, if you're adding up two numbers, the difficulty is based on how many total digits are in the numbers. Basically, if I put a math problem in front of you where you're adding up two numbers, and I add one digit to one of the numbers, then I will have added 1 unit of work to the work you have to do to add those two numbers together. Multiplication is a little bit different than that. If you're multiplying the way that people traditionally multiply, if I add a 1 digit to one of those two numbers, I add basically the amount of work that's in the other set of digits. Because, if you're doing that kind of wedding cake thing, you'll have one whole extra level of wedding cake that you'll then have to add up when you're done. So that would be an example. Addition is a linear process. Multiplication is a quadratic process. 1, 2. They basically claimed that 1 and 2 were the same number, and that consequently there was no algorithmic difference between what I was proposing and the way things currently worked. I got into a very involved conversation about algorithmic mathematics with my lawyers, which I eventually managed to simplify down enough that they got into a very sharp, if you want to do this, we're going to destroy you in court type filing with the patent office. And so in 2021, February 2021, I got a second notice of acceptance. They're like, yeah, we're not going to try to defend 1 = 2 in a court of law. We're not going to do that. Here, have notice of acceptance. We file immediately for the patent. Celebrations once again. And 3 weeks later, they withdraw that second notice of acceptance. This time, in conference with my attorneys, they say they're under orders. They can't really understand the orders from the people who are giving the orders. They don't agree with them, but they can't talk about those people or what the orders are, so they can't tell us anything about what's going on. And they come up with the objection that I would control economics in the United States and its territories if they were to grant the patent, which is, the first try was an understatement, claiming that the patent was worthless. This is now an overstatement. The patent's important and useful, but it's not that important or that useful. But anyhow, they were like, we don't even know if this is what they said. This is the best. This is our best understanding of what we think they said, but what they said didn't make any sense, which is why this doesn't make any sense. And because we're under orders, you're not going to be able to come back and tell us that this doesn't make sense and have us reverse our opinion because, this is just nonsense. Like, this doesn't matter. Uh, so we put together an appeal to file to patent court. I also asked my congressional office to look into the details, just try to find what's going on, maybe extract whatever the real explanation is, or any explanation of what's going on. The patent office lied to my congressional office about the timeline. They completely left out the first notice acceptance, and they also told them to butt out, which is something they've never seen before. They told them that under patent office policy, they only communicate through one channel, and I already have an attorney, and so I should only talk to them through that attorney. That's not something the congressional office has ever heard from the patent office before. They've talked to them on many occasions. I've talked to, at this point, something like a dozen different patent lawyers with an average of decades of experience each. None of them have ever seen anything like this happen to anybody. And so, yeah, last year in July 2023, they scheduled the hearing for next year in July of 2025. And that will be the next time I get to find out what's going on. My filing seems to be fairly solid. Basically, the argument is that they have no arguments. They acknowledge that they have no arguments, and they're breaking their own procedures, and they're acknowledging that they're breaking their own procedures. So, it's, again, to go back to sort of the cop speeding ticket. If you were to contest your speeding ticket in court and the arresting officer was going to testify on your behalf and also claim that the speed trap that you had tripped was illegitimate in the first place. So I don't know what will happen at that point.
Crazy story. Yeah, but maybe if you explain a bit as well, what that pattern is all about, because I think that's important to understand, right? Because you do actually improve a system, right? Like it's not just something that's not noticeable at all, right? Like it does improve the system. Surely, on the other hand, right, it takes away control from the bodies that actually use the current systems.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Right.
what my patent does is it changes the way price discovery functions in commodity markets. And that's esoteric and technical, but commodity markets are the things that control the products that basically make everything that you interact with in your life. So whether it's food, things like rice, wheat, corn, pot meat, beef, pork, are all priced through commodity markets. Energy, um, electrical grids, oil, uranium are traded through commodity markets. Industrial materials and what are so-called softs. So things like lumber, cotton, as well as steel, copper, are all traded through commodity markets. And so the the economic organization of society rests on the information that's produced in these markets, and the cost of operating them is not trivial. Um, in the United States alone, $1 trillion a year is spent just working out who's selling what to whom and at what price. And this system at that scale is thousands of times more efficient. And so it would be possible to cut that number in half, certainly, quite easily. And potentially, I usually cost it out based on the 90% reduction, because, after the first 90% reduction, the next one doesn't have that much of an impact because you're already done almost all the work. Uh, but if you sort of chase that through the impact across the world, it becomes very profound very quickly, because we're spending a big fraction of all the money that we spend in every year figuring out how to organize our economies. And if we don't have to spend that, then that's free to improve things. The broken window fallacy. If you heave a brick through a window, then the guy has to go buy a new window from the glazier, who can then buy shoes for his kids and all this economic activity. But the brick didn't create that economic activity. And if the baker doesn't need a new window, he could instead buy a second oven and have a very similar chain of economic activity, and you can live in a village that has, bread and croissants. So, it's a better place to be. Uh, and that's the window that's open here, is that by making it more profitable to make the stuff that we eat and wear and live inside of and use for tools and machines, we can have better food and housing and clothes and machines, uh, basically for perpetuity.
Mm. Yeah, unless it's the same organization that actually produces the brick, the window, and the croissants, right?
Right. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the other alternative is that we decide to ride these dead systems into the floor and we die with them. Rome had a really good run, but
Mm.
they decided not to culturally innovate. They decided to stay on the pretty much the agrarian plan, which is conquer your neighbor, and enslave them, and that happens to have an upper limit, and that upper limit is basically Europe and parts of the Middle East, sort of like 1,000-mile range or something. And once you breach it, it all starts falling apart. And so yeah, the modern world has an upper limit, and that upper limit is when you start plugging the noise into the decision making, uh, and and that's what we're looking at right now. We've seen supply chains become more dislocated. We've seen market failures become more and more and more frequent, uh, and we'll keep seeing those things because the driving force isn't criminal elites. Not that there aren't prevalent criminal elites. The driving forces are, if you walk through a machine shop in loose clothing, you're going to get beaten to death. And you're not going to be beaten to death because violent felons are running the machine shop, although they might be. You're going to be beaten to death because some machine is going to grab a piece of the clothing you're wearing and, suck you into it until it's killed you.
Mm. Whew. Yeah, that's a deep topic. The the problem that you see with this whole patent thing, like, did you have this thought that fuck it, I'm gonna do something else, or it's getting too dangerous or anything of that sort? Did you feel anything of that nature?
Well, I've had a few sort of dark crises of concern about whether or not I could be delusional or have made a mistake, and I go back and do that over and over again. And I have a handful of other projects that I'm thinking about to keep my brain interested in things. But this is a very severe problem, and it absolutely has to be fixed for there to be an economic future. And while I don't think that economics is a high virtue, it's down near the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy. It's a necessary one. The thinking about what what makes you better as a person if you don't have access to food is kind of pointless. Food makes you better as a person if you have no access to food, and then after that, maybe there's some other things that could be discussed. Um, and from what I can see, that's really what's at play. And so, while I have had a number of interested and uninterested parties comment on the potential physical danger associated with this course of action. Um, I mean, it looks like it's at least worse than that to not do this, as far as I'm concerned, because assuming I get my, normal human life expectancy, I can expect the systems that we are currently using to disintegrate in my own lifetime. Uh, we're like I said, we're already seeing an accelerating pattern of decay and collapse. And so, how would that suddenly slow down or reverse without these problems actually getting solved for real? And in the public sphere, what I'm working on is the only proposal I see that actually addresses these fundamental issues. Um, I would be I would be thrilled to have conversations with people and debates about different approaches and things that might be more or less practical to deploy and try. But it's just me out here waving the flag. So until other people show up with their opinions, I can't get to that point.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people that are gonna see this through. I mean, you've been doing this for 8 years or what? 7 years, 8 years, right? Like most people give up with that kind of stuff. First little wall they are facing, and they're done with it.
Well, that might be just sort of native stubbornness, and it might be again my math sort of history. Um, I I come back to problems that don't get solved. I get a certain amount of satisfaction from solving things, um, and I experience a lot of frustration when I know there is a solution, um, and it's not happening. And so that that's a characteristic of mine that goes way back, and would keep drawing me back to this if indeed I needed that. But you know, I've said this on other podcasts. I have a purpose in my life now, and it's really
Yeah.
irritating to have that. It was a lot more fun to just be thinking about math problems. But but what are you going to do once you've got a purpose? You're stuck.
Well, man, that is your high purpose, probably, right? Like to solve this and to see this through. Like
I
something
hope
something big
so.
as that. Yeah, for
I
sure.
would,
Like you
I
have
would,
to.
yeah, I would really hope that we're not going to decide that it's a dark age this time, and that my work either gets lost, or after people come up with something thousands of times better, some USB drive gets unearthed, and they're like, "Oh, hey, one of these jackasses was thinking about stuff like this. What a doofus!" There's the famous helicopter picture of Da Vinci, and of course, it's not a helicopter. It's an Archimedean screw, which is an invention that precedes Da Vinci by millennia. Uh, and his power source couldn't possibly generate enough lift to make it work. Now, his insight that air functions as a fluid, I think that might actually be something that's attributable to him, and it's incredible wherever it's attributable from. And his drafting technique is obviously way better than me and way better than most people. So I want to take no. I love that picture, but um, uh, I hope that I can make more of a contribution to this problem than he made to the helicopter. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but this guy, he had so many things that he was inventing, right? Like I went to a museum in Germany like many years ago, and I saw what he was doing, because like that's not really talked about. Like so many inventions, right? Like so much stuff that he was thinking about. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah. I have replicas of some of his notebooks, and his sort of drawing and curiosity is an inspiration, and it's
Yeah,
amazing.
definitely. In our prep talk, we talked about the Selden patent because I thought it was interesting. You know how you explained it. If you would like to go down that route a little bit,
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
think
sure.
there's a relation to right like the issue that you have now, right? Because it interlinks a bit, and how
Potentially,
this whole
yeah.
thing can be
So
dismantled. Yeah,
yeah, the Selden patent is a critical part of the history of the American automotive industry. So automobiles get started in Europe, and they aren't built here in America for, I think, a decade plus. Uh, and the primary reason for this is there was this thing called the Selden patent, which a buggy whip company, which ultimately turned out to be the final surviving buggy whip company, had bought. And Selden had patented uh, basically taking an engine and putting it on a horse cart. And uh, the company that owned the patent had their attorneys interpret that as a broad patent on any form of non-horse vehicle, basically, and would use it to crush people that were trying to create car companies in the United States. And so Ford, in addition to being a really good engineer and coming up with new ideas and innovations in factory construction and so on, and also being a control freak fascist that was bugging his workers and seriously crazy, um, got enough backing that he was able to put together a legal team that broke the Selden patent. They took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that the overarching concept of powered vehicles was too broad an object for the fairly limited descriptions that existed within the Selden patent, and that consequently the Model T and Model A and other Ford things could be built and sold in the United States, uh, and so that's pretty critical, because that gets to a lot of the power that patents can potentially have within the system. And should this patent be granted, that would offer me a great deal of potential space in which to launch markets that couldn't use this technique to compete against this technique. Uh, uh, but it wouldn't extend, as they're presently insanely claiming, to the existing markets in any way. And the way that you can be absolutely sure that that's the case is that they also uh, have completely given up on there being any prior art. And so, if this patent could apply to the markets that presently exist, then they would be prior art for this patent that would have to be attached. And they have agreed that that's not true. That this patent doesn't describe the markets that we have. And so, uh, after patenting, there would be a intra-market competitive environment where people would be able to use markets that look like this or the existing markets. Um, the issue, of course, being that because this system is much more efficient, just like people could, buy cars from Ford or drive a horse, or, ride a horse. The cars were a lot faster and a lot cooler and a lot less messy. Uh, and over, I think it's something like a 1 decade period, there's a famous pair of photographs of like a New York City parade in the early 1900s. And then the first photograph, if you look very carefully, there's a single car and everybody else is on a horse. And in the second photograph, again, if you look very carefully, there's a single horse and everybody else is on a car.
yeah, yeah. This adaptation is slow, very slow. Yeah, It's with everything, right? Like it was the same with the internet in the beginning, right? It's a scam, right? You also said that you think the economy has a problem because of the internet. Why do you think that is?
Uh, well, so that gets into this signal noise dichotomy. So there's a guy named Claude Shannon. He was working for Bell Labs, and he was working on the problem of if there's noise on the line, which, cosmic rays, um, backhoe fade. There's a lot of things that could cause a landline to have some issues going on with it. If there's noise on the line, how do you get a clear voice down it? How much clear voice can you get down it? And he effectively invented information theory and kind of finished it too. The paper is fantastic. I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested. But basically, he came up with this conception of information that John von Neumann got him to dub entropy, and which we've subsequently learned is actually very close, if not the same thing as the physical concept of entropy. Um, and just as for physical work, energy sort of divides out into work and heat, and the difference between these things is work is stuff that some human being wants to have happen, and heat is something that no human beings want to have happen. Um, in information, there's signal, which is some information that people want to have, and noise, which is some information that nobody wants to have. And any given channel has a fixed bandwidth, and that bandwidth is chewable up on a one-for-one basis by noise. So if you can perceive 1 bit a year, and I produce 1 bit of noise per year on that channel, you will get zero information out of that channel. Um,
Hmm.
and the markets exist to effectively distill signal from human opinion. Um, and what the internet has done is so radically expand the scope of information within the system to a degree greater than the markets have ever been able to handle before. There's now more information to process than the markets are capable of processing. And so that noise has been taking a larger and larger role in the marketplace. And so these crashes from this perspective are very easy to understand. The market's behaving in ways that are irrational and crazy because it's random meaningless noise, and that's all it is.
Yeah, or it's been fabricated, right? Like in an
uh,
intentional way, right?
In many cases, yes. There's definitely criminal activity that's engaged in the markets, uh, but even worse than that, it's perfectly possible to put in uh, non non manipulative, intentionally false signals just to destabilize other people's ability to perceive where the truth lies in order to cause them to make non-rational decisions which you can then exploit. So, like if you're at a poker table, one thing you could do is just fold everything to create this impression that you're getting very bad cards and you're an incredibly tight player, so that you can then create the appearance. Once you get some good cards, a run of good cards, you can bet into them strongly, create this incredibly tight image that you can then exploit by sort of, pretending like things are reversed. Or you could do the precise opposite of that. And so by having it be very inexpensive to create these false personas, because they're just machines lying to other machines, it's expensive from the perspective of, like a home bank account, but for a hedge fund playing with tens or hundreds of millions of other people's money, no biggie. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, we get this situation where there's just an enormous number of poker players, uh, and that's one of the more successful hedge fund managers in history is also a professional poker player that intentionally trains his people in poker first, according to him, and has them understand the business as a prospect of basically attempting to lie other people out of their money, and that's the foundation of their entire system. So yeah, it gets very very meaningless very quickly, and and again, when you go to the grocery store, the outcome of these lies is what you are paying for the food that you're buying.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't think about this kind of stuff, right? That a hedge fund, has a great impact on the commodity market, and there's other people that basically dying on the other end, right, because of an inflated price of rice or grain or whatnot. But yeah, it's a more serious problem actually than most people understand, I guess.
Yeah, it goes both ways. I was talking to a very engaging lady in Australia. Their milk market is apparently severely bad to the degree that they have a suicide problem among dairy farmers. Um, and now I kind of live very heavily off of dairy, and I find that pretty bad. Dairy's not a you can live without it, and many people actually have to because most people
Yeah.
aren't lactose persistent. But yeah, it's certainly a bad condition when the people that produce food have such a hard time making a business function that they're contemplating death as an alternative to making food.
Yeah, there's plenty of issues in that topic, right? I mean, the first one is that raw milk is not really available, right? Like it's just that inferior product that everybody has, right? On the other hand, I think that's on purpose, right? Like it's happening in Europe as well, um, in all farming niches.
Oh yeah, yeah, and things like the farmer protests that have occurred in multiple countries at this point. They are certainly correct that their governments are currently actively attempting to put rules in place that would make it somewhere between impossible and suicidal to continue working
Yeah,
in their chosen fields. I guess Jeremy Clarkson has, created a fairly successful show on Amazon describing how difficult farming is, even when you're a millionaire that makes thousands of dollars every time they decide to go on television. Uh, but uh, but yeah, in addition to that, the markets themselves are sucking up as much of the possible income that's there. I brought this up many times, but it's crazy enough that it bears repeating. When Russia invaded Ukraine, that was like the third largest wheat producer on earth invading the fifth largest wheat producer on earth. Wheat markets went absolutely ballistic, and as a result of that, Canada and the United States, who are number one and number two, increased wheat production by 0 acres because the market traders managed to capture that entire price spike without passing any of it along to the people that actually make the food, creating zero incentive for them to make more food, and so that's where food shortages in the aftermath of that came from.
yeah. I mean that's another topic actually. But yeah, it's insane. I mean that everything that happened around that is. Well, it's not insane. It's just the way it's done, right? And it's clearly not by accident. That's for sure. You you're very skeptical of the blockchain.
I'm afraid I
Yeah,
am.
yeah,
I have,
because
yeah, technical and cultural issues with the design.
yeah, yeah. Elaborate, please.
So,
Let's go down that road.
sure, the cultural issue I see is that much like the gold bugs, their impression of the problem is that currencies are unsound. And I would not like to imply that currencies are sound because they aren't. And sounder currencies are better than less sound currencies. That certainly appears to be true. However, my contention is that the markets are broken. And so even if you could plug a sound currency into the present markets, if all transactions had to happen in, you know, physical iridium, and iridium basically comes from meteor strikes, so we're not getting any more, and that was basically just it. The markets are broken enough because of the information stuff we were discussing that they still would be broken and they wouldn't work. So even if Bitcoin or Ethereum or the next meme coin really is the magic bullet to create a stable currency, uh, it doesn't matter because the markets are broken in ways that make that not work. But the technical issue I see as potentially a bigger deal, uh, is that the chain proposals that exist, and are in use are tied to specific implementations of hashing algorithms, and they're that way because doing it across multiple hashing algorithms would increase the costs, and chain management difficulties to a degree that we don't presently have any way to understand how to control. That problem might be solvable. It has not been solved. The difficulty is that while there are no publicly known defeats of these hashing algorithms, um, there are a large number of hashing algorithms that we used to use for which there are publicly known defeats. And the existence of defeat of a hashing algorithm breaks the chain in very fundamental ways. If you can solve the hashing problem quickly, the proof of work thing goes out the door. Right now, you would basically have to have the resources of like the EU or the US government, and you'd have to manage to fully coordinate them around breaking up the blockchain. And right now, those entities have more than interests than just that, and so it's basically fairly safe. But if the algorithm were broken and you had access to it, then with the sort of home computer setup, you could derange the blockchain, uh, and and that would have obviously severe consequences. It is pretty likely that that derangement will happen, that breakage will happen within the next century, because that's sort of about how long these things last on the way this thing's timeline functions. It may well be the case that working hash functions can't exist. We have an existence proof, and there's two different things, either of which might exist. Working hash functions that can't be broken are one of the two things that might exist, but it might be the other thing. And so, uh, without a a technical problem to sort of a long-term cultural maintenance project around them, if if people were proposing physical elemental money like gold or silver or iridium, um, and and the specific kind of thing that being proposed was actually plutonium, and not the long-term stable kind that we have, but some exotic isotope with a half-life measured in weeks. I would have similar reservations about that. because you're proposing something that's just not going to be around for very long in terms of where we want societies to exist. And so that colors a lot of my thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's kind of where they want to go with CBDCs as well, right? Like it's going to have a half life, and you can only use it for certain things at a certain time, right?
Yeah, well, and also the record keeping, particularly
Mm,
for CBDCs, the notion that's sort of a dream come true for surveillance state actors
yeah,
who there don't seem to be exceptions to surveillance state actors in the modern political climate of those who are actually interested in government. So that's certainly disturbing.
yeah, definitely. Like, do you see people thinking about that kind of stuff in the U.S., or is it just a
Uh,
minority?
very very small minority. Skeptics of CBDCs tend to be sort of the hardcore crypto nerds, or sort of old line uh, uh, financial conservatives who are like, "Oh, the system's perfect; nothing needs to change," which is insane. Or you know, the existing institutions are completely corrupt and nothing useful can come out of them, which is not completely insane, but uh, not not necessarily a good point of view for building new systems.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, extremist views is yeah difficult. But yeah, what you said before, it's interesting, because like to me, right, like blockchain and CBDCs, it's if you get kind of society used to something that looks a bit similar, nonetheless, the technical side of things is could be different, but like you get them used to it, right? Like it's already happening right now. Like, yeah, you don't need cash anymore. The 500 euro note is gone. The 200 euro note is gone too soon, right? So slowly they're creeping in, right? Giving incentives to pay by card, or by app all the time. It's happening.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, and
Yeah.
like the ETFs. I
Mm,
I would be unsurprised, although this definitely isn't investment advice, if these ETFs cause the chains to go up in value enormously, just because it becomes highly convenient for people to put money in, and when that happens, the chains will go up, and because of the unstable nature of how our markets function, it's very likely that a bubble would be caused by that behavior pattern. Um, how sustained that bubble will turn out to be is something upon which I refuse to speculate. But it's a reasonably predictable pattern that seems fairly likely to happen.
mm. Interestingly enough, these approvals they went through pretty fast. So
Yeah, yeah, and so that gets to sort of the cultural problem, and Ethereum is actually an excellent example of this. First gen Ethereum had a bug in it, which isn't the end of the world unless you decide to base your entire economic system on a esoteric and complicated coding system of computers, which who would be insane enough to do that? Uh, and some hacker figured out how to basically take all the billionaire's money and put them in his account. And if Ethereum were true to its word, which obviously it isn't, they would have just lumped it. They'd be like, "Oh, sorry, Peter Thiel, but that $100 million is gone now. You've got other hundreds of millions of dollars. You can put those in and play the game after we fix the bug." But instead, they just forked it and said, "Yeah, that never happened. The rich are all still the rich." And the community went along with it. And it's not necessarily that it's bad for the community to go along with the continuation of itself. I mean, they didn't run the Salem witch trials or anything, uh, but but the proposition that the public computer code produced hashes would be the source of truth was put to the test, and it failed spectacularly.
yeah, who do you think is behind these systems? Do you think it's another DARPA project, or what's your take?
Uh, I tend to think that there's not so much, conspiracies behind the scenes. The DARPA projects are fairly open about what they're doing. I mean, the internet was very publicly developed in the first place. I think that most of the stuff is being done by the people doing it, um, for reasons of personal enrichment, and the ones who are being feted and funded. I think Sam Bankman-Fried gives us an excellent notion that the people that are connected and manage to leverage those connections into greater connections and corruptions get promoted within and by the system. Uh, I've been told on numerous occasions by many people that I should lie to advance my project. I haven't done that. I have no intention of starting to do that. But I've been told by many people that, if you're not lying, you're not trying, basically. And that's standard operating procedure. That might be the case. And it might be the cause of my failure. I certainly hope it isn't. But in an
No,
environment like that.
it's very very stoic. You do the right thing when no one is looking, and that's what it's all about. I think for us men, especially. I don't think just to lie and to move your way through that stuff is in that manner is the right thing to do. I don't think so. Especially it will bite you in the ass, down the line, like how you view yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, again, like, I like thinking about these math problems. I one of the one of the keys of mathematics is that your premises are your conclusions, essentially.
Mm,
And so, if you infect your mental landscape, you're not really going to be able to think clearly anymore. And
no,
and I value that too much to disturb it over a little thing like having an income.
yeah. Yeah, in the end, that's just an ego problem, right? When your sole focus is on the account, what's in there, and power later on, right, as well. Okay, nice. That's a very nice ending here. Where can people find you if they want to support you and see what you're doing and all that good stuff?
Sure. Well, you'd mentioned there's a podcast, The Fourth Age. You can listen to me and Marty talk about AI and stuff. Occasionally, we have guests. The project. So actually, people want to support me. Sign and share. There's a petition on change.org under CDM_patent. And yeah, they'll ask you for a donation if you want to. That's fine. But if you just share it on your social media, that does everything that would have done for me. But yeah, get that out there, certainly, please. And if you want to learn more about these coordinated discovery markets, there's a website, coorddis.com. And there's like a white paper you can download, links to video explanations, stuff like that there.
Very cool. Yeah, we'll link it in the description. Perfect. Thank you, Noah. That was great. Thanks for your
Thank
time.
you, Max. That was a lot of fun.
Great.